Hey guys, so we've had a string of really competitive events the past weekend, most notably YCS Chile, but also there were some nationals as well as regionals. So what I thought I'd do is just go through some of the topping deck lists that were publicly available and map out the most played hand traps and staples as usual. And the way I did that is using these valuable resources here by following the card launcher store and Ready for Duel and just going through the deck lists that they have compiled among the topping lists. And so, definitely make sure to follow these guys on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. It's really valuable resource, and certainly you will not regret it if you follow it. And before we continue, a big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes in the description below. So now, among the topping deck lists that were at least publicly available based on the events that happened the past weekend, I was able to compile 31 deck lists for this video. And so a big caveat too, though, is that because we do not have all of the topping information available, this pie chart may look differently if we actually had all of the lists, right? So for example, the most glaring difference is that we don't have a lot of Superheavy Samurai in the video, even though they actually had a decent amount of tops the past weekend. So those are things to keep in mind because, for example, certain hand traps or staples might be more predominant in certain decks. A clear example would be something like, let's say, Dimension Shifter is most notably seen in pretty much every Kashtira list. So the more Kashtira that you have, then of course it's going to look like Dimension Shifter is played a lot, but it might just be a little bit more niche to certain decks. But at the very least, Kashtira still has the most tops in general as well so far post Sayak. So we do have the majority being Kashtira in this deck. This video as well, and so of course branded Labrynth, Mathmech, they're doing pretty well. Purrely's there, and there are some random inclusions too, like for example Sword Soul, Eldritch, Dynamorphia, Trap Tricks, Rika, all really solid decks, but not seeing as much success in this current format. But who knows, maybe with more time in this current format, and if that bandlist ever drops, maybe there will be more tops from them as well. And so in terms of a brief overview of the hand traps, so right now the median based on the past weekend, at least the list included in this video, 11 hand traps is a median number in the main deck, which is very high and a lot higher than the 6 we saw about a month ago with the last time I did this with the previous YCS. So definitely trending upwards. I think that is not surprising, because if you think about some of the top decks right now in terms of Kashtira, Purrely, as well as something like Superheavy Samurai, they're decks that can play a lot of hand traps and have a lot of flex spots. Also Mathmech as well. And then in the side, the median number was 4, which is about the same as previously. In terms of the general going second board breakers, so this the median number was about 2 in the main, which has certainly dipped a bit since the last month, and also this is lower than the traditional historical numbers that I've shown on the past couple years. And I think part of that explanation would be, I know that I don't have a lot of Super Heavy Samurai lists in this video in particular, but in general overall right now, Super Heavy Samurai is a deck that cannot play your traditional spell and traps, and general going second board breaker cards, the best ones are typically spell and trap form, so that would certainly explain it as well. And just people are playing a lot of hand traps right now, and it's just best to try to stop, for example, Super Heavy Samurai before they set anything up, because if they set up something like Kashtira or Spell Cancer, it's going to be really hard to play through, especially when they have 1 to 2 negates on top of that. In terms of the side, about 6 board breakers is a median number, which is about the same as it has been not only the past month but just in the past couple of years in general. So in terms of the most played hand traps in the topping list that were publicly available, the first was Drone Lockbird, which is probably not too surprising, right? I mean, we sort of expected this heading into this format because with the hype of Super Heavy Samurai, and it's a good deck, as well as Purrely. This card can be really good against both of those decks, and technically it can be good against Kashtira as well. It's just that, if they resolve Shifter, you're just not going to be able to draw, which is unfortunate, but it's really good against a variety of different decks right now, and especially against Rogue too. It's always been good, so I don't think it's very surprising that it was the most played hand trap. And then at number 2 is Ash, which is still seeing good amount of play. Now, of course, usually Ash is the number 1 most played hand trap in almost every format that I've done these analysis. But the interesting thing too is that Ash usually has always been something that you either main deck or you don't play at all. And nowadays, you do actually see several decks still deciding to side it instead. And I actually understand that, and that's because sometimes you may feel that Ash is just, you'd rather play different hand traps or board breakers in your main, but it's still important enough to side Ash just because it is so strong against something like Branded that it's worth siding for. And so against Labrynth as well, it can be really good to prevent them from getting those big lady Labrynth whatever out into the field. So it still has applicability right now. And Imperm is also another really good one, and the great thing about Imperm right now especially is that a lot of decks are playing Talents as well as Thrust, and Imperm can play around that because it is a trap and not a monster effect. So it's still really strong against certain decks. Of course, something like Labrynth, it's not going to be great, but pretty much every other deck, you're going to have a good time if you have Imperm in your hand. And then we have Gamma. So interestingly, it's still high, despite the fact that, you know, the play of Sprite has gone down a lot, and Sprite has typically shown in the last month or so that they will play Gamma, not only for its hand trap effect, but also to be able to bring it out with something like E-Tele to have a level 2 body and start Sprite combo. But you know what, Gamma is just a really strong hand trap in general that it still warrants play in other decks as well. And especially you've seen Rise and Labrynth, and they are pretty good with Gamma because, you know, a lot of times they don't have any monsters, and then they'll start like activating Welcome Labrynth or something, they get Ash, and then now you can Gamma them. So it can be really clutch, but it sees a play in a lot of variety of different decks as well. And then at 5th is Nibiru. I was, in a way, I guess, kind of surprised that it still saw this amount of play, but at the same time, you know, Kashtira is the best deck, even now, despite the release of Superheavy Samurai as well as Purrely. So I think this still makes sense. You can really punish them, especially in game 1, because a lot of times you might just expect this to be a side deck card nowadays. But as you can see here, at least among the deck lists that did play Nibiru, they actually were more likely to main deck it, and I think it can really throw players off guard in game 1, and you can steal a lot of wins when you draw that Nibiru, especially when your opponent's just not playing around it, thinking that they're just not on Nibiru at all, let alone game 1. Number 6 is actually, it's going to be Mathmech and Druid's Worm. It was kind of interesting that this is actually seeing a good amount of side play now, and even though we're past that tier limit format where we saw this in essentially every deck list and it was the most played hand traps. But now, you know what, it's still pretty good, especially against something like Mathmech, which is still being seeing a lot of good play, and actually a good amount of regional tops as well for sure. And so this can be really, especially Mathmech can be really good against that strategy. Against branded, Mathmech also is really detrimental against your strategy. You know, you can banish something like Albion, and also on the end phase you add another Bestial, so you know, you just will protect yourself from getting Gimmick Puppet Lock, which is really key and actually gets you to play. So these are really strong cards that you can consider, especially the Magma Nut. And then we have Dimension Shifter, which of course is really more so because of Kashtira and a lot of play of Kashtira, and they're likely to play this deck in almost every list. And the interesting thing too is previously in the last format, Kashtira players were siding Shifter for the most part, because with, you know, Kashtira being obviously best deck, there was no reason really to main deck Shifter when you're just going up against each other a lot of times. But nowadays, you know, Shifter is good against Superheavy Samurai in particular, and can be technically good against Purrely too. I know they can sometimes side that card themselves as well to combat against Superheavy Samurai, but nonetheless they cannot play optimally under Shifter just like Kashtira can, or let's say something like Flu Under East could. And so it's still a really strong card. I'm not quite sure if this would ever get hit on the ban list for us. In the OCG, I believe it was put to 2, but it's certainly a really strong hand trap if your deck can play it. And then speaking of other hand traps, Ghost Spell, this is kind of interesting. I mean, it's not the best against all decks, unfortunately, but against certain decks it has really good use. You know, for example, against Mathmech, something like the Factorial, you can stop that, which is very nice. Against Branded, there's a lot of point of interactions with Ghost Spell that you can run, but of course, again, it's not something as generic as something like Ash or Imperm or even Drool in this format, so perhaps that's why it's not seeing as much play, but still something you could consider. And then lastly we have Ghost Ogre. So when I first did a brief overview of some of the most played hand traps in post Syac format, Ghost Ogre was quite high, but now it's sort of fallen down. Who knows, maybe we give it a little more time, maybe in the next YCS Philly this will sort of jump up again. It still has a pretty good use right now, you know, against Superheavy Samurai as well as Purrely, and some against certain other decks. Against Branded, it's never been that amazing, but nowadays technically with either, you know, Cartesia or Quem, it can actually do some damage when you ogre them at the right time. So there's that. So it's certainly something you can consider. As well as most played board breakers, I actually decided to just group all of the kaijus together this time. So this, even though the image itself is Gamma Seal, it's just all of the other kaijus, you know, Radiant, whatever the other ones. Technically, I'm realizing now, perhaps I should have also combined Santa Claus on top with this, which was seen in at least like 3-4 other lists as well. So kaijus really strong right now. Aside from just getting rid of that, you know, spell cancel or exterior, but also in Kashtira can be really good if they sort of just end on a rise hard pass, which I guess they're not doing as much nowadays. They're still going for that zone lock play now. Again, it keeps on flip-flopping, but also Kaiju against Purrely, the Nor, is really strong as well. They can get some follow-up, of course, but you know what, for a lot of decks you might just not be able to out it otherwise. So really good to have, and certainly something that you should probably consider for your side deck at least. And then we have some back removal and Cosmic Cyclone. So despite the complete decline in play of like runic variants, presumably because of Super Heavy Samurai with like Spell Cancel or Exterior, or you know, something like Purrely, Cosmic Cyclone still has a lot of, I think, applicability right now. For example, against Purrely, you can get rid of that continuous spell. Against Superheavy Samurai, you can always get rid of scales as well. Against Kashtira, getting rid of Birth is always really strong too. So it has good use. Also, I think maybe perhaps some players might be concerned about anti-spell fragrance that might be cited because of something like, for example, Superheavy Samurai and their pendulum mechanic. Cosmic Cyclone or something like Twin Twisters is always kind of nice to have. And then speaking of back row again, Feather Duster usually is like the most played kind of staple side deck card in general, because there's no drawbacks to this card, and now especially with like Runic not being as prevalent where the Hugin would protect it from Feather Duster, so Feather Duster is always nice to have. And then we have Talents, which is something I sort of alluded to earlier, really strong, and I guess among the list that played it, they all main decked it if they played it, and so it's really good, especially in combination with something like Thrust as well, particularly, going second, can have a lot of variety of effects to really swing the momentum of the game, and so especially in a format where there's a lot of hand traps being played, this card is probably a lot more live than it was in any other formats. And then, of course, we have Evenly Match, which is not seeing as much play as we did. We saw a couple, or rather a month or two ago. Still very strong. I think it's a little iffy too though, because again, something like Superheavy Samurai, you might have too many negates to have to go through to even be able to resolve this. Again, something like Branded, it used to be really good against Branded. The problem now is that with either Expulsion or Sanctified Dragon, they just give you a monster and you just cannot resolve that evenly anymore. So you know what, it's iffy, but I think it's still certainly a respectable card to put in the side. And then we have Dark Will No More. This one's also in a weird spot right now, because if you think about some of the top decks in the format, of course, it has utility against Kashtira. Of course, it's not going to free up your zones or anything. And again, something like Superheavy Samurai, again, if they have spell cancel up, then you're just not going to be able to play this at all. Again, something like Purrely, of course, it is useless against Noir, but at the same time, you might be forced to put something like this in because they are playing a lot of cases, Vanity's Fiend in the side, so you have to have something to negate that as well. And so, you know what, and against Branded, it's never been that great, and Sprite has for some reason seen a huge decline in play, even though this card is great against them. So I think Dark Ruler is kind of iffy, but as a generic going second card, it's always been so great that I can see why it's still seeing a good amount of play. Call by the Grave, I think this is kind of self-explanatory. Sometimes there are formats where this is just the most played card, and if anything, almost main decked all the time. But nowadays, again, it's a hand trap heavy format. When you're going first, you might as well just put this in for getting rid of or stopping hand traps from preventing you from playing. But also, in a lot of cases, other than just stopping hand traps, it has utility in any other kind of against most decks. And then we have Dimensional Barrier, which is, of course, initially when last format started, with Labrynth being able to turbo this out so easily, and they still can. And Branded is seeing actually a good amount of tops in terms of regionals, nationals, whatever, so far right now in this new format. So it's still good to have against Purrely. It can have applicability as well because it can negate that Noir. So you know what, it's solid. I think not every deck is going to play this anymore, as we saw like at the beginning of the last format, but something like Labrynth, when you're seeing a lot of representation from them, you know that this card is still going to be in the format. And then speaking of other powerful traps, is a pointer. It's quite sacky, of course, nowadays, with this just being at 1, and with Red Reboot being banned. I think this should just be straight up banned. I think it's a little far too strong, especially post side. Decks usually have a advantage going first anyways, and to have this, you pretty much will almost guarantee yourself the win. So I think it's not really healthy. Same thing could be said with Dimensional Barrier as well, but still a very strong card nonetheless. And then another going first card that I alluded to earlier is Anti-Spell Fragrance. I actually thought it might see a bit more play than this, and perhaps if we had all of the deck lists available, maybe there were more Anti-Spell Fragrance, but again, it can just completely stop that pendulum mechanic. So again, Superheavy Samurai can be great. Against Branded, this card is absolutely devastating. So it's a side card that you just have to assume, and that's why you're probably going to be putting in cards like Cosmic or even Evenly to be able to sort of get around this. And so it's another card that could, in my view, should be banned, but you know what, I can see why some people might think it's needs to be in the game. So anyways, that's it for the most played hand traps and staples among some of the premier events this past weekend. So hopefully that was useful in terms of helping you prepare for any of your upcoming events. We do have YCS Philly coming up very soon, so hopefully that was useful. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. A big thanks to all my Patreons as usual for their continued support, and well, take care guys.